Joining me today is Katherine Howe. She's the New York Times bestselling author of The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, and more recently, The House of Velvet and Glass, her second novel that came out earlier this year. Katherine, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about the differences between writing these two novels. You start out with Deliverance Dane, which puts together a narrative set in the present, or at least the near present, with one in the early Americas in the 17th century. For The House of Velvet and Glass, though, you're writing about the early 20th century in the wake of the Titanic disaster. And you bring all these moments to life in really compelling ways, but I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the unique challenges of each period, about the research, the writing, the voice.
Well, as you surmise, the differences are pretty profound, and they have largely to do with the source base. And so one thing that I tried to do with Physic Book of Deliverance Dane was spend a lot of time in the primary sources. And one of the nice things about writing a story that's set in the 1690s is it's before that sort of, there's a kind of a gap in the kind of sources that are available in early American literature that happens when, sorry, there's a cockatiel talking in the background. If you look at court records from the early part of settlement in North America, you actually have a lot of detail that you can work with, that you can really get a sense of how people talk. And we're fortunate that, especially there's been so much attention to the Salem trial, that there's really no shortage of primary sources to look at. And so I tried to think in a detailed sort of way, not only about the material culture of that time and the visual culture of that time, which is what my background is actually in, but also to spend a little bit of time thinking about the speech and the way that people would talk and the way people would carry themselves. And so a lot of the Salem transcripts are actually written almost like an episode of Law and Order, like a court transcript. It's a tricky balance because in historical fiction you have to signify age without being so antique that you are incomprehensible.
Right.
And you also have to signify age in a way that feels right, even if it isn't. So, like, if you look at the way that Arthur Miller denoted the way people spoke in The Crucible, he uses words and phrases that have no business being in 17th century discourse, but nevertheless managed to signify age in a way that feels authentic. And in a funny way, with fiction, the feeling of authenticity is more important than the authenticity itself. And so one thing that I tried to do was I wanted to be as authentic as I could from what I understand of the circumstances in the 1690s to be. But I also didn't want to leave my readers behind. And so I thought that was pretty important, an important thing to do.
So in The House of Velvet and Glass, because that's closer in time to our own age, is it even more challenging then? Or were there particular challenges in writing about the early 20th century?
I have actually a little bit of the opposite problem with The House of Velvet and Glass, because a lot of our slang today is actually a lot older than we realize. And so there were occasional choices of words and things that my editor would point out as being anachronistic, which weren't anachronistic at all. You know, to say that I have a yen for something, that is a very teens thing to say. In fact, even the use of the word cool first started showing up in the 19-teens in kind of music undergrounds around that time. So one thing that I tried to do was to, again, the problem is the same. You have to signify the age in a way that feels right. But with The House of Velvet and Glass, I had to signify in the other direction. The other thing that I wanted to avoid in both Physic Book, Deliverance Dane, and House of Velvet and Glass was what I've started thinking of as the masterpiece theater problem. The idea that everyone in the past spoke in a very correct and proper and sort of English way.
Prithee talk.
When of course people in the past used slang, they used shortcuts, they had bad grammar, they were lazy in their speech in the same way that we're kind of lazy in our speech today. And so that was something that I wanted to think about as well. For The House of Velvet and Glass, I read a lot of literature from the time period, which is a good way to kind of get into some of the slang. But I also read a lot of primary sources as well, especially gossip magazines. We tend to think that gossip magazines are a recent innovation, but in fact they're not. And so I read a lot of popular press and gossip magazines and things to get a sense of the rhythms of speech and the kind of things that people would talk about in the 19-teens.
Now, your sense of research is different than most novelists because you are also a PhD student, a graduate
Yeah.
student at Boston University.
I am.
And your protagonist in Deliverance Dane was also a grad student. I know you've talked about that before.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you can discuss a little bit how you've balanced these two sides of your research and writing life, how they relate to each other, how they don't.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that balance is the wrong word to use because I started working on fiction when I was about halfway through my PhD program, and I'm still, as you say, in my PhD program 2 novels later, and so that means that I've been spending a lot more time on fiction than I have been on academics. But one of the things that I've really loved about fiction is that I think that a lot of people, a lot of readers in particular, are very interested in moments in the historical past. But, you know, a lot of us, the way that history is taught, especially at the secondary level, we're taught that it's all about memorizing battles and dates and who the presidents were. And that's not what it's like at all. I feel like history, when researched in a really rich and interesting way, especially cultural history, which is where my interests lie, can tell us a lot about not only the way that life was lived in the past, but also can give us a lot of insight into the way that our lives are lived today. So one thing I've really enjoyed about writing fiction, I've tried to establish a brand within my fiction such that readers know that if they read a book that I've written, I've done the legwork on it.
Right.
That, you know, it'll be a fictional story, but it will be based on intellectual and cultural truth that you can actually kind of dig into and respond to. That's what I try to offer to my readers. And what that means is that I can then have a really cool, interesting conversation about questions in history with a much broader audience than I would have if I were just teaching within the academy. Although I love teaching and I've enjoyed doing it and I hope to continue doing it. But I feel like it's a neat way of bringing habits of academic thought into popular discourse in a way that can't really happen in other contexts.
Does it go the other way, though? Do you think there's more that academics could do to bring a more popular, more public flavor into their writing? So are you thinking at all about your dissertation in these terms as telling a story in itself?
Well, I think the best academic writing does do that. I mean, I can name a bunch of history books just off the top of my head, secondary sources that are hugely readable and that you can sit down and read through from the beginning to the end. And I have had the pleasure of meeting and working with historians who are able to do that. Mm-hmm. So I think that that's definitely happening, you know, at the top level within history. I think at the graduate student level, the PhD level, it's a little bit more challenging just because there's so much pressure to try to carve out a unique topic or a unique point of view on something that, you know, I think that there's less flexibility in the kind of research that can happen at the PhD level for those of us who are trying to kind of get into the academy at that point. At the same time, I think, especially now when there's so much discussion in the academy, especially about the role of the humanities and about the increasingly sort of professionalized move in especially undergraduate education, I think that there's a lot that we can do as humanitarians to think a little bit about ways to bring the humanities into relevance. Mm-hmm. You know, it always surprises me to try to think that that the importance of the humanities isn't manifestly obvious, but I have to accept the fact that, you know, to a lot of people who are coming into college these days, a lot of people who are thinking about going into debt for a bachelor's degree, the question of relevance and the question of professionalization is very much at the forefront. And so I feel that as a culture worker and also as an academic, it is in some respect my job to further that conversation, to think about, you know, to think about ways to think critically about American culture beyond the ivory tower.
And that it's unusual for a historical novelist to think that way. Think of a historical novel writing as a form of cultural work. I think that's really refreshing.
Thanks. Thank you. Well, the most important thing for a novelist is to tell a good story, which is something that I try to do. But one of the things that I grapple with in my own teaching is I feel that with historical fiction especially, there is an intrinsic contradiction, which is to say, if fiction exists to tell a story that is transcendent, that can create empathy in any reader regardless of time, regardless of space, then it doesn't matter what time period you set a story in. It could take place at any time. There's no reason not to set it in the present. And if you want to learn something true about history, then you need to look in the archive, you need to look at the primary sources. So why does historical fiction exist? Is it really just that we want to read stories where people are dressed up in funny costumes and wearing corsets and pointy hats? I'd like to think that historical fiction has more to offer than that. And one of the ways that I approach that, for instance, with Physic Book of Deliverance Dane, for me, the thought experiment that gave rise to Physic Book was, you know, when we talk about the Salem witch crisis, we talk a lot about hysteria. That's a word that comes up a lot. We talk a lot about why it was such a big panic. But one thing that I think we miss is that everyone who was involved in the Salem crisis actually believed witchcraft was real. There's actually kind of a funny history of science question at the center of it. You know, what does witchcraft mean to you if you are an individual who thinks it's a rational thing to have a witch trial? And I was very interested by that question. You know, what if one of the Salem witches were real, but in the way that the colonists actually believed witches to be, rather than in the way that we have them today, and, you know, pointy hats and the Wicked Witch of the West. Right. So for me, I feel like that's a really interesting intellectual history question, and a novel is a pretty fascinating and fun thought experiment by which to investigate that question. And so for me, that questions like that are what really inform the fiction that I try to produce. Of course, not everyone is going to read them for those kinds of reasons. Right. Mostly, I think people want to read the books that I write for fun or for escapism, and I think that that's legitimate too. Sure. I think there's a lot to be said for the role of culture in providing pleasure.
Do you teach historical fiction, whether old historical fiction like Sir Walter Scott or contemporary? Have you brought that into the classroom?
I have. This last spring and then this coming spring, I will be teaching a sophomore level seminar in historical fiction through the American Studies program at Cornell. Great. And what we're doing is we're looking chronologically, we're looking at examples of primary sources, secondary sources, and historical fiction and putting them together to see, you know, first of all, what has changed from what the historical record tells us to what the examples of fiction we read are doing, and what does historical fiction tell us about the ways that we approach history? Because, of course, certainly in the study of American history, there's certain periods of time that are fetishized, that are given lots of attention, and then there's certain periods of time that are left by the wayside. So, for instance, we're reading Johnny Tremain, which was a book that was written in the 1940s. It is a wonderful, wonderful book, even though it was written for young adults. It was written by a woman named Esther Forbes, who was herself a historian. And in fact, the older I've gotten and the more I've read about Revolutionary era Boston, the more respect I have for Esther Forbes. I mean, her geography is accurate, her mode of speech for people is very interesting. So I think that there's something to be gleaned from putting these different kinds of sources together and to thinking in broader terms about the approaches that we take to the study of American history.
Well, what's next for you? There are rumors thick on the ground that there may be a sequel to Deliverance Dane.
I'm chewing over a sequel to Deliverance Dane. I do have plans for Connie Goodwin and her family. At this very moment, I'm working on 2 novels simultaneously. We'll see how well that goes. Okay. One is going to be an upstate New York ghost story. I'm living in upstate New York now, and so I've been thinking a lot about the Hudson River Valley and about Washington Irving and about the relationship between this sort of ghostly landscape of upstate and the Erie Canal and with New York City. So I'm working on a story about that. And then the second is actually going to be probably a book for young adults, which is going to also be a witch story, but this time from the standpoint of the afflicted teenagers. There was a case last spring in upstate New York of an outbreak of conversion disorder at a high school, which, anyway, it was a very interesting kind of case, and they thought that there might have been an environmental cause, and it turns out there wasn't an environmental cause. And so I'm thinking a lot about the experience of conversion disorder from a teenager's point of view, and how that can relate to witchcraft in the 17th century.
Great. Well, Katherine Howe, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. This was a pleasure.
Yeah, mutual. Thank you so much.